Tonight, no evidence found that the government ignored intelligence on foreign interference, but there are serious issues with the way the intelligence is communicated, says Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference, David Johnston. And a lawsuit against Quebec's government for banning prayer rooms in public schools. Muslim groups call the ban a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We cover stories about Austrian Muslims being targeted for their faith, Israel working to expand the membership for its Negev Forum, and global armed conflict and the world's failure to protect civilians. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I am Catherine Bullock. Canada's former Governor-General and a Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference says foreign governments are undoubtedly trying to influence candidates and voters in Canada. David Johnston says this fact has been known by successive federal governments and they have responded in various ways. Johnston says he has not found any ministers or the Prime Minister knowingly ignoring intelligence. However, he says there are serious issues in the way intelligence is communicated and processed from security agencies to the government. In his first report on foreign interference released today, Johnston says a public process is required to address the issue of foreign interference, but he recommends not holding a public inquiry, saying it is not needed to bring transparency to the issue. He says a public inquiry would not be able to disclose sensitive intelligence, so an inquiry would not help with the public trust issue. He says, instead, a public process would be sufficient for that. He intends to do the work himself until his term ends in October this year. Quebec Muslim groups are challenging in court the provincial government's ban on prayer rooms in schools. The ban was imposed last month. It applies to all public elementary and high schools, vocational schools, and adult education centres. The ban does not apply to private or Indigenous schools. The advocacy groups call the ban discriminatory and a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Last week, 5 Muslim organisations filed their case in Quebec's Superior Court. They are also seeking a judgment on how the government interprets secularism and religious neutrality. Quebec's Education Minister Bernard Drinville ordered the ban during Ramadan when 2 Montreal area schools permitted Muslim students to gather in a room for prayers. Drinville says that the school's space cannot be used for religious practices. Doing so, he says, is against Quebec's official policy of secularism. The advocacy groups argue that Quebec's Secularism Bill 21 applies to the state and not to its citizens. They say they are going to court as a last resort. They say they had warned the Education Department about their lawsuit. The Education Department has declined to comment. The United States says it is concerned that the Al-Aqsa mosque complex in East Jerusalem is not being treated as a holy space. In a press briefing yesterday, a spokesperson for the State Department said that the Al-Aqsa mosque complex should not be used for political purposes. The spokesperson is referring to what happened on Sunday when the far-right Israeli minister Itamar Ben-Gvir forced his way into the Al-Aqsa mosque complex. Once inside, he claimed Israel's ownership of the holy site. Several countries, including the US, Spain, Turkey, France, Jordan, Qatar, and Egypt, have also condemned the provocation and the minister's inflammatory rhetoric. Israel's opposition leader, Yair Lapid, also slammed Ben-Gvir's move, calling him, quote, an irresponsible and fanatical man. Sunday's storming comes after tens of thousands of Israeli nationalists marched through the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem's Old City this past Thursday to mark Jerusalem Day. The day marks the capture of Jerusalem in the 1967 Middle East War. The celebrations saw far-right groups storm through Muslim quarters chanting slogans, "Death to Arabs." Videos circulating on social media show Israeli nationalists provoking Palestinian citizens. New research is showing that Austrian Muslims experienced 1,334 incidents of anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia last year. This is in a country that only has 700,000 Muslims. The report by the Austrian Documentation and Counseling Center for Muslims states that the majority of these attacks took place on digital platforms. Out of these, 15.2% of anti-Muslim attacks were against men. Women endured double that, 40% of the attacks. The figures also show that 92% of the online attacks constitute hate speech against Islam and Muslims, while 5% are incitement. Nearly 40% of these attacks occurred in various areas of social life in Austria. The capital, Vienna, saw the largest number of racist incidents at 112. The report says these figures only reflect a portion of total attacks. An official from the center says anti-Muslim racism is becoming normalized in Austria. She says Austrian politics denies Islamophobia exists. Israel is trying to get another Muslim-majority African country to join an Arab-Israeli summit scheduled to take place in Morocco next month. This country, which has not been named, currently has no ties to Israel. An Israeli newspaper reported yesterday that the issue was already under discussion between the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The newspaper speculates that this unnamed country might be Mauritania. There were some reports from earlier this year showing that communication channels were opened between Israel and Mauritania. However, Mauritanian officials deny this. Mauritania ended its ties with Israel in 2009 after an Israeli war on the Gaza Strip that killed 1,400 Palestinians. Israel is trying to expand the Negev Forum, which is an economic and security summit that includes Egypt, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. These Arab states have all normalized ties with Israel. Morocco will host the summit in the last week of June. The summit had been postponed last year after Israel's current far-right government was formed. This year, Israel has launched a wave of deadly attacks on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, killing over 150 Palestinians. An anti-terrorism court in Islamabad, Pakistan, has granted bail to Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan in multiple cases. Khan has had more than 100 cases filed against him since being removed from power last year in April. Pakistani media reports that the court has granted bail to Khan in at least 8 cases until June 8th. The South Asian nuclear country has been in the grip of a raging political turmoil since April 2021. That was when Khan was ousted from his position as Prime Minister through a no-confidence vote. He now demands snap elections, which are otherwise scheduled for October this year. Khan has also fallen out with the country's powerful army and is facing a plethora of cases that his supporters claim are politically motivated. It is alleged Khan and his wife received billions of rupees and a large piece of costly land in 2020 to build an educational institution in return for releasing an amount of $236 million to a property tycoon. The anti-graft department alleges that Khan's deal with the businessman caused a huge loss to the national exchequer. Khan and his party leaders deny the allegations. Starting today, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has begun his 2-day business trip to China. Speaking at the Russian-Chinese Business Forum in Shanghai, Mishustin praised the relations between the two countries. He described the relationship between the two nations as distinguished. Mishustin says Russia and China will work in the sectors of energy, engineering, shipbuilding, drone production, and the timber industry. The Russian Prime Minister said the Russian-Chinese cooperation will strengthen the economies of both countries as Russia faces numerous international sanctions. Mishustin's visit to China comes after an invitation from Chinese Premier Li Qiang. China and Russia have recently undertaken high-level visits. President Xi Jinping paid a state visit to Moscow in March, which was followed by the Chinese defense minister's trip. Mishustin vows to increase the trade volume between the two countries to $200 billion this year. The head of the UN says that an estimated 43,000 people have died as a result of armed conflicts last year. Antonio Guterres is warning people that war is devastating lives around the world. He said this during a UN Security Council meeting on the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. He says the total number of people forced from their homes due to conflict, violence, human rights violation, and persecution reached 100 million refugees, just over 1% of the world's population. He says conflicts are driving global food security. Guterres says last year, more than 117 million people faced acute hunger, primarily because of war and insecurity. That is about 3 times Canada's population. He says the world is failing to live up to its commitments to protect civilians, calling it a, quote, terrible truth. Guterres is demanding that those who commit war crimes be held to account. Thank you for watching. We need your support for donations. Please scan our QR code or go to our website, muslimnetwork.tv, to make a donation so that we can continue to broadcast the voices of Muslims at home and abroad.